Welcome to London, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today I'm going to discuss a little bit about some misunderstandings around inflation. I've done a bunch of videos on it, but this is inspired in particular by a video, or not a video, a tweet that was put out where somebody who's actually quite smart and insightful, etc., made a kind of common fallacy statement about how inflation works. And this was, they said, you know, if you were to have, say, a loaf of bread for $1, and all of a sudden you gave everyone in the world evenly 50% more money, nothing would change. The price of bread would simply be $1.50. And this is actually inaccurate. So I'm going to cover a little bit about how inflation actually works, some of the reasons why it's notably misunderstood, and kind of dive in accordingly. So before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell if you'd like any assistance with relocating abroad, setting up residencies, citizenships, optimizing your global tax, forming international companies, doing banking, etc. Please reach out to us. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below. Or you can send us an email through our website, offshorecitizen.net. Okay. So inflation, very quickly. So people confuse the idea of inflation with monetary expansion. Okay, so just from a linguistic standpoint, it's very important to note that increasing the money supply is not inflation. That is monetary expansion. Monetary expansion is one factor in the inflation calculation, but it is not the only thing. So inflation is price increases, in particular, broad price increases. Okay, so in the example that I gave at the beginning, where we said, okay, you increase everybody's amount of money by 50%, that would be a 50% evenly distributed monetary expansion, okay? So now pricing comes about from the interaction between three factors, and it's these three factors, it's the third of these factors that seems to be left out in most of the calculations, and therefore people kind of have a misnomer about how it works. So the one, of course, is the supply of real goods and services. Okay, so in other words, there's a supply side component to it. The second is what we call the demand side. Okay, so demand is actually what people desire. All right, and the third is what I would call capacity. Okay, so capacity is essentially the amount of money that they have. And so note that in most models, demand and capacity become conflated. And this is a very, very important distinction, that they aren't actually the same. They're quite different. And we're going to see some examples of why we see inflation go the way that it does, and why inflation numbers might be lower, and things like that based on this. And I've done some videos previously. I've talked a little bit about supply-demand side. So for example, if you have a proportional increase in supply as you do in kind of monetary supply and demand, then you should basically, they should neutralize each other, right? So one way of putting this, somebody I was talking to, kind of, it's an overly simplistic model, but it essentially states that monetary expansion minus increase in productivity, or minus money supply minus productivity equals inflation. That's kind of the, or I guess it would be monetary expansion minus increase in productivity equals inflation. Okay, so that would be kind of like a very simplistic calculation. Now, it ignores things like monetary velocity, which does matter. It ignores where that money goes. It ignores a variety of different things, but those would be some factors that play some of the biggest role in calculating this. Okay, so productivity in this case we're measuring basically as the increase in volume of real goods and services. All right, so kind of understand that as a starting point. So let's say that we go and we suddenly have more money tomorrow. Okay, what happens? Do you suddenly go and spend more, or do the prices of things automatically rise? The answer is no. And why is this? Because the demand for those things often hasn't changed. Okay, so again, this is where I want to separate. What's happened is, in this example, our capacity to spend has increased, but our demand to spend on the same things has not. And this is because demand tends to progress in sort of what I would call an S-curve, meaning that at first you don't have demand for something because you're worried about something else. So in other words, our demand tends to progress more or less in step with kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? In other words, if you're sitting there starving, you're not really worried about, I don't know, some sort of like golf course, golf tickets, right? You would say, hey, listen, I want to go to the golf course, buy some passes to go golfing. I'm not worried about that when I can't buy food, right? So in other words, my demand for this discretionary thing is extremely low to none at first until I first take care of these other needs. So, and loosely speaking, we're kind of generalizing. We have survival needs first, then we have safety needs second, and then we start to get into these other, status needs and connection and self-actualization and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's the first part to understand, is just that demand progresses this way. Now, the second part is at the top end, okay? So let's use food as a simple example. Elon Musk makes a lot more money than most people, has a lot more money than most people. How much food does he consume relative to me? Probably basically the same amount, right? So in other words, you can see how his capacity has increased, but his demand has not. So my demand for food is pretty much maxed out because I can pretty much afford whatever food I want. I don't really care what the price is because it doesn't really affect me. So I just eat the food that I want. And so when I was, at a certain stage in my life, maybe I would have liked to demand more food. And most of the time we have, we increase our food demand up until a point where, so it's like, you're gonna go up and you reach a stage where you're basically you have enough calories consumed to fill you up, right? This is why we're using food as an example. So you're filled up. Now, what you'll do is, as you have more money, you may spend money on more quality food. You may spend money on more convenient food. So your actual food spending may increase somewhat, but even that will top out pretty early. If you go to the top restaurants in the world, you go to a Michelin 3-star restaurant or something, it's typically like, I would say $300 to $500 per person is kind of a typical meal, which is expensive for most people. I'm a big food guy. I did 1 year every Michelin 3-star restaurant in the Eastern US as one of my birthdays. And so, cool experience. But that's kind of like the top end. I think the most expensive restaurant in the world that I've seen is a place called Sublimotion, which is in Saint-Tropez. They had, Saint-Tropez or Ibiza, somewhere around that. And they had it in Dubai for kind of a few months in this past winter. And it's like $2,000 a person, right? So this is like a super expensive meal. Obviously, yes, you can have very rare situations where you go to some particular meal that they bring in all these top chefs and put $500 of black truffles on your stuff and special caviar and wine and but just generally kind of a menu that's kind of the top end. So even the most extreme example of somebody spending on food, they're probably spending maybe an average of $300 a day for like a single person. Maybe a little bit more when you throw in drinks, etc. That's like the top end that you can possibly spend. So this basically provides a limiter on how much demand for food there can ever be. And because of this, if everybody suddenly had lots more money, what would happen to the price of food? Basically nothing, right? Basically nothing. Now, you could have cost push inflation, which we'll talk about in a second, which could drive up the price of food. But what would happen is the demand would remain the same, and the excess capacity that people had to spend would simply not get put into food. It would go somewhere else. And this is why this idea that, hey, we all of a sudden have more money, so the cost of bread is going to go up. No, the cost of bread will not go up because people will not take their excess money and bid up the price of bread because they've already filled that with their first, they had $100, now they have $150. They've already bought bread with their first $100. So what happens is we kind of say, okay, well, with this new $50, where does that money go? That's the really important thing, okay? As we're tracking monetary expansion, we need to track where that money is flowing. And what we find is that, first of all, it tends to flow from people who are less good at accumulating it to those who are better at accumulating it. So you never end up with even dispersion. Typically, the more monetary expansion you do, actually the more you increase gaps between rich and poor. Not so much because poor people are worse off, but because of the fact that rich people have more excess money, because you're essentially playing a game where some people take the game more seriously and are going to be good at taking it from others, and that's kind of the way that it's going to go. So, and by the way, that's not necessarily a malicious thing, but it's, for example, I may design products and services that you want. If I decide I want to make more money, what do I do? Well, I mean, obviously people can do things maliciously. they can go and try and invest, etc. But they can also go and produce real goods and services and optimize businesses, etc., in order to increase profits. And so money will flow to certain people disproportionately to other people. That's what's going to happen. In addition to this, what we're going to see is that people are going to move their spending increasingly up the ladder. And so what do we see? Well, we see luxury goods doing really well, right? We see travel doing really well, because these are things that people previously weren't spending on. You can just kind of think about it this way. Demand in this kind of like S-curve flow, and you have kind of like a series of S-curves on top of each other, you can kind of say, all right, a person has demand, and let's say they start at, say, their demand pyramid, or whatever you want to call it. You start by filling up the lower levels. And so as they have more capacity, you can think of like capacity as water pouring in to fill up this pyramid. You know, what are the things that it's hitting? And so you're going to start by, of course, taking care of survival needs first. Then you're going to take care of safety needs probably. And once you get beyond that, you're going to start paying attention to things like status needs, right? So all of a sudden you have more people who are spending more money on status. Well, what's happened? The supply of real goods and services on the status side haven't increased. In fact, inherently, some of those things can't. For example, optimally located real estate. So I'm in London today. And if you look at, say, Knightsbridge, for example, right, you've got some very high-end properties that have gone super expensive. Why? Because they're in a very, very desirable location, and it's inherently monopolistic. The nature of status dynamics is if everybody has it, it's no longer valuable. And so you're going for these things that are quite rare, and you're pushing the prices of those things up because people have the capacity to bid it up, right? So you have a lot of capacity. The demand is there once people have fulfilled their other demands, and so you start to bid those things up. And then it turns out the last part of where money goes is basically liquidity sinks of investments, right? So people will, of course, they'll set some money aside for savings. They'll have some sort of a demand for savings. You have to consider that savings is a product and service in itself. Dependent on people's kind of level of uncertainty, they will demand a certain savings rate, and so that savings rate will get filled up. They'll put money into investments. They're going to be probably become increasingly reckless in terms of kind of the gambling stuff they're willing to do. Hopefully they get to some point where they're concerned about philanthropy, etc., and off they go. And so this may make you say, okay, well, like, what about these rising prices then, right? How does this rising prices stuff work? Well, the main way that this rising prices stuff works is then through cost push inflation, and this is through kind of competitive demand for scarce resources. So let's use some examples here. So the demand for travel goes up, which means that the demand for fuel goes up, which pushes up the price of oil. Now, the price of oil happens to ripple throughout the whole economy, and this becomes a thing. Next, the opportunities for people to make higher wages in certain areas goes up because people can afford to spend more on that. So whether this is businesses that are profitable who can afford to monetize more, or you have people who are rich who can afford to hire people for them, you do have some influence on wages through this process, and wages will typically go up, right? Those wages going up, of course, pushes up the costs for businesses, and the businesses then have to pass on those costs to their customers. And so you have this cost push inflation that goes throughout the supply chain. It takes some time to ripple there, but it will get there eventually. What are some other examples? Some other examples are, of course, maybe there's various different things that you need to mine for. Maybe there is limited transportation infrastructure, and so whoever can bid the most pricing for getting deliveries quickest, etc. We saw this over the last couple of years as the shipping lines became basically backed up. You had an increase of like sixfold in some cases for the cost of shipping for, say, companies like Walmart. So you had that. So you can run down the long list and see how these costs can go through the supply chain because of disproportionate demand in certain areas. And so then you get kind of, some of these areas will push up in order to make that work. But it will be isolated to certain segments of the supply chain. So let's use some examples here. So if you can increase your production of something like wheat, right? Well, then you're not going to be affected. The base cost of the ingredients is not going to go up in the bread, right? You may have an increase in the cost of wages eventually if you kind of have some sort of kind of circulatory environment, Whether that happens or not depends, but at some point you could see that, and this will happen accordingly. So anyway, I guess I wanted to kind of point out that the way that money flows, when you have monetary expansion, the way that money flows, you can kind of track it, and it's fairly predictable to understand where it's going to go, where it's not going to go, based on understanding just natural human demand, and then realizing that people can't spend beyond their capacity. And so as you increase their capacity, they're going to ratchet up which level of demand they're fulfilling, which is going to put added pressure on the supply within certain sectors of the economy, which is going to drive the prices up and kind of absorb some of that liquidity. The other thing that I think is probably worth understanding is, we've talked, of course, about the supply side here, or sorry, the cost push from things there. You could also pay somewhat of attention to how this obviously will eventually reach a point where that money takes away from those costs, take away from people's available liquidity, and that in turn is then going to mean that they're going to rebalance their spending to somewhere else, or take away from these higher end areas, which is why asset prices tend to fall due to inflation, in addition to, of course, rising interest rates, because they would try to combat the rising inflation. But the rising inflation hurts people on the lower end of the spectrum more, and so those people provide political pressure onto governments, which then means that they're going to raise interest rates and so on, and you kind of have this ripple effect. So anyway, that's a basic overview of tracking things through inflation, and hopefully it gives a different model than what you'll sometimes hear, because people seem to miss out on this difference in capacity versus demand, and it's really important. It makes all the difference in the world, both going the one way as well as going the other way. So if you have any questions, put them in the comments below. I will look forward to seeing you on the next video.